My name's Doug Meyer. I'm managing partner of Covenant Technology Partners, and so I have the honor of kicking this off today and turning over to Gary Bell, and I'll introduce him in a second. But before, just since some of you might not be very aware of who Covenant is, Covenant Technology Partners. So Covenant, we've been around for now 21 years, focused on helping clients to apply Microsoft technologies. And we've been working with, I was sitting here thinking earlier about how long we've been working with SQL Server and the Microsoft data technologies. And well, it goes all the way back to before, if any of you remember what Sybase was. So it goes way back to Sybase, and even before that, I'd say probably DB2. So if we talk predecessors, we're talking way back in the 80s, working with these technologies. So anyhow, it's incredible how far we've come since those data platforms. But anyhow, so Covenant's been around for quite a while. We've been focused on data and AI our entire existence. So Covenant started as an organization focused on data and AI. So it's really neat to see where it is today. But we are U.S. based, Central Time Zone primarily, but we serve clients all over the world. We do a lot of work with manufacturing and healthcare and financial services. So with that, let me introduce Gary Bell. So Gary has been a data architect for a long time. I won't get into how long, but a long time, and has been specifically
not working with the 80s, Doug.
What's that, Gary?
Not since the 80s, like you. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Well, that's true. So, yeah, since the 90s. So not that much younger. But anyhow. So Gary has a tremendous amount of experience and really is super knowledgeable. So we're very happy to have Gary presenting this topic today. And this is a presentation that Gary's actually presented a couple times now. And gotten really good feedback on it. So hopefully everyone will enjoy it today. Promise you're going to learn something new. So if you like learning, you're going to enjoy this presentation. So with that, Gary, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Doug. Here we go. Okay. Good morning, everyone. As Doug said, I'm Gary Bell. I'm a data analytics architect with Covenant, and we wanted to just go through database mirroring in Fabric with everyone today. Quick look at kind of what we're going to go through agenda-wise. We'll kind of. It sounds like there's about a maybe 50-50 split or so with those using Fabric today. So we'll spend just a couple of minutes, real high level, talking about Fabric and how it fits and how mirroring fits into that. But then the story we really want to tell today is around loading data and moving data from, kind of as Doug alluded to a moment ago, from your various source systems and getting that ready for analytics. And in our case, specifically getting it out into the Fabric environment so that you can take advantage of that platform for your various, typically kind of your Power BI reporting, but then we'll talk about other things we can do with it once it's in that environment as well. So we'll go through a few slides. I'm going to jump into some demo and show you how easy this is to get started and what it looks like. And then we'll circle back with some questions, some frequently asked question stuff, and I'll talk about the longer term roadmap. I should go ahead and start by saying that mirroring in Fabric is a new feature. It's still in public preview, so it's not fully it's generally available. It's just not fully released at the moment, but it works pretty well, certainly the way it is. So we'll take a look at it and step through it. So just real high level, talk about kind of the challenges that this the Fabric in general and database mirroring are kind of meant to address here. And so I think as we look through these are very kind of high level and pretty generic problems that I think most just most organizations in general would probably almost certainly every organization has some degree of every one of these four problems. I think it's fair to say. So I'm sure that as you're looking at these, a lot of kind of nodding the head. What's maybe a little disappointing about these is that I probably could have cribbed this slide from a deck that we put out 15 years ago, because these are kind of universal challenges that have been prevalent for some time. As Doug said, the tools that we have available now to address these problems have come a long way from 15 or 20 years ago, certainly. But unfortunately, it's in kind of the data arms race, if you will. The complexity of the data that we're having to ingest, the velocity of that data. We're dealing with a lot bigger data sets where the data is coming in a lot more often. There are different types of data, so we feel like in some cases it's easy to see why organizations feel like they're kind of treading water. And the tools get better, the technology available to solve some of these issues, um, and certainly we're going to look at that today, has come a long way. But these are still mountains that we're trying to climb, and not ones that we've really kind of put behind us by any means. So let's talk about Fabric in general. I know there's some familiarity here. Some people are already using it to some degree. Others may be at least aware of it. A real high level here for those are just really to kind of maybe give us a baseline here in terms of what we're talking about. The Fabric is what we've done here. What Microsoft has done is they've pulled together a variety of different services that have been available in Azure for some time. And just if we start over there on the left for Data Factory, for example, I mean, that's Data Factory. There's been an Azure Data Factory uh, product in Azure for a number of years, as well as some of the data science and data warehousing. Maybe some of you are using some of those various services in Azure itself. What Fabric attempts to do is really kind of twofold. It pulls all of these various services into a consistent platform and makes it pulls it into a software as a service model. I think everyone here is probably familiar with Power BI, and so it really has kind of built out the Power BI environment and kind of folded all these other services into that software as a service model. So as you know from Power BI, when you have access to the Power BI portal, there are no backend servers to monitor or manage. When you pay for Power BI, you pay for the service, and they've extended that model here to fold in these other what they call personas or workloads in Power BI. So whereas Data Factory in the past it was a consumption-based service in Azure, and you paid for how much compute you used as you processed maybe a big overnight load of data over it through Data Factory. Now you're basically purchasing a Fabric capacity. It's a shared shared service that runs out in Azure, of course, and all of these various workloads share that capacity and share the resources within that capacity. But within that capacity, you have kind of free reign to use it as you would like. So if you want to go heavy on the Power BI or heavy on the Data Factory, that's up to you. So that's the software as a service model. The kind of the second pillar here would be this OneLake that's highlighted below that. And the OneLake, so in addition to bringing all of these various workloads into a single kind of UI that's consistent and can be managed that way, OneLake underpins all this as a single storage location for all of your various data. Again, if you think back to doing this in kind of our distributed mode in Azure prior to Fabric, where again, maybe you've got a data factory running and maybe some data warehousing, it was at times difficult to kind of share that data across these various services. It could be done. You had to understand security and kind of get the various system accounts shared and working together. But it could be a pain as well. And so we've tried to simplify that. They've OneLake again underpins all of these various workloads and allows allows Power BI to use the same data as your data warehouse or as the group of folks in your organization that are doing data science on top of some of this data that's here. So OneLake is kind of key to really making a lot of this work the way that Microsoft has envisioned. And so then the question becomes, how do we get data into the OneLake? So we have a few options here, but primarily, as I referred to Data Factory here a few times, Data Factory is probably the primary. It's certainly that's the primary use case for a tool like Data Factory, and we have a few kind of versions of it, if you will, in Fabric. We have what they call a data flow Gen 2, which is very much like Power BI's Power Query. For those of you familiar with, if you go into Power Query and hit that transform data button, you get into the little Power Query window. They've basically taken that interface and pulled it out into Fabric online on the web, and you can manage it that way. Data pipelines are more like your traditional data factory jobs. So those are two of the primary ways. And what we're trying to do here is we're trying to get data out into not only the OneLake, but into a Fabric, either a data warehouse or a Fabric Lake House, I should say. And doing so creates what we call these Delta-enabled Parquet files. That's really just kind of the storage. It's an open source storage mechanism for the data. But that allows you to do a number of things with the data, and that's kind of the consistent storage format that OneLake, and in fact most of these Fabric workloads that we looked at, prefer. So we're trying to get data out into the OneLake, and we're trying to get it into Delta-enabled Parquet files. Again, the two different options there in Fabric apply. But as we're thinking about what that looks like, and this is the part that really hasn't changed much if you're trying to load data from a source system. And I'm sure most of you who are at all familiar with what this process looks like, and my guess is that anybody that has any kind of a data warehouse, a reporting platform, or a reporting database has processes similar to this running, as Doug mentioned earlier, maybe on a daily or nightly basis, that takes data out of your main kind of ERP or your OLTP kind of systems that run your business, sucks some version of that data out, probably snapshot kind of that data out, and then syncs it over to a warehouse or reporting database. Those processes, those ETL processes that are running, there could be any number of tools that you're using to do that. If you're in the SQL Server ecosystem, again, maybe it is Data Factory in Azure, or maybe it's still SQL Server integration services. But the approach that we take is typically very similar. You have the kind of the truncate and reload option, where you just take kind of the entirety of, let's say, your orders table every night, and you kind of clear out the version that you have in your reporting database, and you copy over the version from the current version from your source system. That, of course, works really well. It's fairly simple, but it's not very cost effective in terms of the amount of work that you have to do, the amount of data that has to transfer over every night. Majority of that data that you're reloading it was the same as it was the day before. And so then we get into approaches that try to be smarter about the way we go about that, in terms of trying to figure out maybe what data's changed, or just load the most recent data. But then you have to worry about the merge logic and the back and forth on so the ETL gets a lot more expensive. It gets more expensive to build. It gets harder to manage. It gets more difficult to maintain as the source system changes. And it frankly, having built and supported a number of these over the years, the issues around troubleshooting it when you have problems becomes kind of burdensome over time as well. So again, the tools have changed over time in terms of what we use to kind of pull data from a source platform into a kind of a reporting environment. The methodologies, or the kind of the broad approaches that we use have remained fairly stagnant, if you will. So you could probably see where we're headed with this. So an alternative to maybe the more traditional approach is to mirror your database directly into, in our case, into OneLake or into Fabric. Mirroring, the technology behind mirroring itself is not, again, all that new. I mean, you may, again, say in an on-prem SQL environment, you may have a mirrored or something similar in terms of SQL technology, kind of read-only version of a OLTP database that is used, again, for reporting purposes. So that the concept here is similar, but the difference being that we're able to mirror that directly out into the cloud and get it out here in in OneLake in a format that can be used across all these various workloads that we touched on earlier. So you see down here at the bottom of our image here that we have a few options. We're going to focus today on the one in the middle, the Azure SQL database. But there are a few others that are currently supported in this public preview. There's the ability to mirror an Azure Cosmos DB, if anyone's using those, or a Snowflake database. If you're already doing some of your data warehousing in Snowflake, there's the ability to mirror that over here into OneLake as well. And we can talk about maybe some of the reasons you might be interested in doing that in a bit. But from a SQL standpoint, what I really want to highlight, it's kind of well, it's highlighted over there on the right, that the zero ETL. Once this is enabled and turned on, Fabric takes care of the rest. It monitors the Azure SQL database. It detects any changes, and in near real time. And I say near, we're talking about minutes, probably in some cases sub-minute. So it's not. I wouldn't quite call it streamed out. So it's not real time, but you're going to, as you see a record appear in your source database within a few minutes, it should sink its way over into your reporting environment. And we'll take a look at what that looks like here in a moment. But there's zero for you to manage in terms of the ETL. So all those processes that we just touched on a moment ago in terms of writing all that logic that figures out what's changed and what's different and how to merge that up with the data that's already out there from a reporting standpoint, all that goes away. We can flow it out here to OneLake and let Fabric do the rest. So it's replicated and kept up to date in near real time, as I mentioned. And then at that point, once we have that data in OneLake, there's really any number of things that we can do with it. And we'll show a few of those as well. The one that we're going to kind of focus on today is pulling it into OneLake and then being able to present it in a Power BI report basically right away and have that data update without any additional refresh. But as I said, once this data is here, once you have your OneLake synced version of your source data, you can use it for some of the data science applications, or you may want to transform it further into more of a standard star schema model using maybe using Data Factory and then dropping it into a data warehouse and things like that. So we're only going to kind of scratch the surface on some of the potential use cases for it. But if you think about what that could mean for your organization, is again, I imagine that throughout most of your organizations, you have a nightly, probably at best a nightly ETL processes that you've spent a lot of time building and you spend a lot of time maintaining. In this environment, we can remove the need for a lot of that, or at least remove some of the plumbing involved, and let Fabric manage it for us. So just to be a little more specific here and diving a little more deeply into the Azure SQL database use case here, is anyone, if you're familiar at all with SQL Server, you may be familiar with a feature of SQL Server called change data capture. And what that does in SQL terms is it's a service that you have to enable at the database level. You turn it on and it will watch specific tables if you set it up that way, and figure out and kind of keep a record of what's changed, kind of a little log behind the scenes so that it's easy to tell, at a certain time this row changed, or this value in this row changed. And so this approach here in Fabric uses a very similar technology. The way that works behind the scenes in SQL Server is it monitors the transaction log in SQL Server to figure out what rows have changed. And so Fabric does, even though you don't have to turn on change data capture and you kind of skip some of those steps that are needed to enable it in the traditional sense, it uses a very similar approach. It uses again, it monitors that transaction log, and that's how it figures out what rows need to come out and get pushed out into the OneLake. As I said, as it pushes data over here, as it flows data into the OneLake, it automatically transforms that data into these Delta Parquet files and lands them in OneLake. All of that's taken care of by the service. There's no transformation that you need to worry about. But as they land out in the OneLake, then they become available in a Fabric data warehouse. And we'll look at that here in a moment. And then from that Fabric data warehouse, you can do any number of things in Fabric. The one that's kind of highlighted here is the SQL Analytics endpoint. So even though that data flows out into the OneLake in these Delta Parquet file formats, it still exposes a SQL endpoint that you can interact with in more or less standard T-SQL parlance. So most of your I say, so most of your select kind of statements that you've traditionally run against a regular SQL database will all run out here against that same data. Again, even though it's not sitting technically in a SQL format under the hood. So any other third party or any other systems that you have that traditionally connected to a SQL database, and maybe a reporting database you have now or a data warehouse, can connect to this environment as well. It's just you get a SQL connection string. You can connect something like Management Studio to it. You can connect Excel to it if you want to do that, write traditional SQL queries, and still consume that data in a kind of a traditional standpoint or traditional fashion. So I'm going to jump into a demo here real quick. And I should have said up front, if there are any questions along the way, please drop those in the chat or raise your hand there. I think Doug or Michelle or somebody's going to kind of monitor that, and they'll let me know. You don't necessarily have to save those to the end. But as I jump over here into my demo environment, if I can find that. Okay, so we're jumping out into what traditionally has been the Power BI portal. Now it's kind of the Fabric portal, if you want to think of it that way. I'm in a workspace here, kind of a demo workspace that I've set up. And to turn on mirroring in SQL for SQL Server, for Azure SQL database, I should say, we just drop into the new menu up here, and we'll go to more options. It's not one of the ones that immediately exposed. And then down in the data warehouse section, you can see we have a few mirrored options. We have a mirrored SQL, Snowflake, Azure Cosmos DB. We'll just jump into the SQL one and just show you how easy this is to get started. So we're going to select a SQL database. At this point, we can just type in our connection string to our server. Stop right there real quick. So you type in the name of the server, the name of the database, and then of course you can choose how you want to connect to the server. You have your kind of typical options between SQL authentication or an organization account. You can even use a service principal. I'm going to finish. Mine I think are saved in here. Yeah. So we connect to the database. And at this point, it should connect and should find a list of all the tables. You have a few options here. You can select all and have it sync the entirety of your schema over here. Now there is a limit. Currently, there's a 500 table limitation. FYI, in case you have one of these big, ugly OLTP systems that has all kinds of tables, that you may run into that limitation. I don't know if that's something they'll overcome as it exits public preview, but that's the current limitation. So you can select all, and when you do select all, you get a further option down here to automatically mirror any future tables that show up. So again, if you really are committed to getting everything over here, and you want to monitor it in case new tables show up, and you want those to pop over here as well, it's smart enough to do that. But I think for larger databases, it'd be more common to probably sub-select a handful of tables that you may want to pull over, and select them yourselves that way. Now, a few things of note here. First of all, you'll kind of notice the little error message up here. You can only sync this database or your source Azure SQL database to one mirrored copy of it in Fabric. And that's because, again, the technology that's used, that change data capture type technology, is kind of a one-to-one capability. So since it's being used and kind of keep track of what's been sent out and what hasn't, it can only have one destination. And frankly, there's no real need to have multiple mirrored versions of the same database out in Fabric. Once you've mirrored it out here once, you can share it amongst workspaces and give various other people access to it. So one should be enough. It's worth pointing out, though, as well, that, again, because the technology is so similar to change data capture, you also can't have both enabled at the same time. You can't have change data capture itself turned on, excuse me, on the source database, as well as a mirroring destination out in Fabric. It's one or the other. And the reason mine's highlighted here is because I already have this turned on. I didn't want to have to go through it all completely live here to speed things up a little bit. So we'll jump over to the version that's already running here in a moment. So there is that restriction. The other thing to note, and I don't have an example of it, but not every data type from SQL Server is supported here. So, but I think most of the ones that you would be interested in from an analytics standpoint will be just fine. The kind of data points, the kind of data types I'm talking about would be like your geometry data types, or maybe an image data type, things like that. And if you have those in your source tables, you'll get a little yellow warning, I think, over here, and it'll tell you that there's some columns that cannot be synced. The good news is it'll just skip the columns that it can't deal with. It won't prevent you from mirroring the entire table.
Hey, Gary.
Yeah.
Quick question. Is there a path for utilizing on-prem SQL databases to feed this process?
You're getting a little ahead of me, but today, no, there's not yet. And I know that that's a big ask from the community, and that's definitely on Microsoft's roadmap. They promised to address that one. I think they're actively working on it. We don't have a specific date, but I know that's on the roadmap and should come some point in the future. And that'll obviously be big, because I know there are a lot of organizations that are still supporting on-prem. Yeah. Well, and I've got a slide here at the end, and we'll kind of talk a little bit more about that. But yeah, that's currently the current state of that. So, and this is really it. So once we've selected which tables we want, and again, decided whether or not we want to turn on the automatic sync, we hit connect, and away it goes. I'm going to skip that part again because I've already got it set up. And I'll just show you what it would look like kind of when we get to that next step. It only takes a few minutes to get going. This is a small database. I've only got a few thousand rows in most of these tables. So I think when I actually set it up, it took 3 or 4 minutes, but I didn't want to sit and wait for something to spin for 3 or 4 minutes. So we're going to skip a step, and I'll just show you what this will look like when that actually gets done. So you get 3 things here. See if I can make this a little bigger. Might be too big. You get 3 things right away. So we've created this wide world importers mirrored database. That's the first object you'll see in here, and then it automatically creates these other 2 items as well. And you can see that it creates make that bigger. It creates a semantic model, a generic semantic model. So right away, it's creating a Power BI model for us that we can use for reporting. And it creates this SQL Analytics endpoint. And let's just pop in and take a look at, let's start here, because this is the first thing you see once you get it. It'll pop over to this window and say that the mirrored Azure SQL database is starting, and then after a moment, it'll say it's running. And this is how you monitor the replication to see kind of what's going on. It'll show you how many rows have replicated over, and those will tick up as changes occur. You can see the last time it detected any changes and pulled those over. So in my case, that was an hour ago as I was playing with this, and we'll push some more data through this here in a moment. So you can monitor it that way just to make sure that everything's healthy and running. And then once you have data over here, and again, as you can kind of see that row counts. For me, it was thousands of rows. If you've got a big database that you're initially trying to sync, you may have to wait some time, and I don't know what to tell you in terms of guidance. It's going to depend on what kind of Fabric capacity you have and how much data is being pushed over, et cetera. But But if you have a large database, that may take a little bit of time to initially sync. So let me jump back to where to go? The workspace. Let's take a look at the SQL endpoint now, just so you can see what this data looks like once it's out here. You'll see right away that we have, again, this is a very SQL Server database kind of look and feel to our data, right? We have our schemas and tables, and then we've got the 4 tables that we synced over here. We can click on a table. You'll see the data that's in the table will come up here in a second. So you get a sense for that. You can see a moment ago we can write traditional SQL queries against these tables that are out here now. Again, oops, I think it's just me that. This data is not in SQL format per se. It's in those Delta-enabled Parquet files that exist out here, and that's a very columnar data structure. So unlike a traditional SQL Server table, this is more in line with really the kind of data that you would typically put into a Power BI model. That columnar format is the way that Power BI typically stores that data. And one of the benefits to having the data in that format is that Power BI can run directly on top of that same columnar Parquet files that have now been put out here in the OneLake for us. So not only can we query it SQL in traditional SQL methodology, but Power BI can use it almost natively in what they call this direct lake mode to run directly against the files themselves. So what that will allow us to do is, instead of having to build in a Power BI model on top of this data, in a traditional sense, we would open up Power BI desktop and we would connect to this SQL endpoint, and we would pull our data in that way, and it would, and by default, it would put it into import mode in Power BI, and then we'd have to publish it out to Power BI and schedule a refresh that happened on a regular basis, nightly or a few times a day to pull that data in. Only to have Power BI really store the data in a format that's very similar to the way that we already have the data structured out here in our OneLake now. So we can skip that part of it and just have it connect directly. In fact, I can even show you what that looks like here. So we're on our SQL endpoint here. We can go up to the reporting tab. As you noticed, there we were workspace level a moment ago. It already created a default semantic model for us. We can take a look at what that looks. In fact, let's just go to the model view that I had up there a moment ago. So, this probably looks similar for those that are familiar with Power BI. We've got our tables that show up in here. We have the relationships created. And that's all part of that base semantic model. So now we can jump over here and create a new report. Again, this is direct lake connectivity to our to those Delta Parquet files that have been built. So let me just do that as a. So there's the 2-3 years worth of order history that we have out here. Again, I haven't built my own Power BI semantic model. I haven't had to refresh any data. If we get a little more granular here, let's even go down, and then we can show what this is going to look like. Let's maybe just show the last week's worth of data. So you can kind of see here, if you zoom in a little bit, that we've got data up through yesterday. As I mentioned a moment ago, we can interact with this data with traditional SQL tools. So here I've just got Azure Data Studio connected to the same SQL endpoint that exists out in our Fabric environment. So this is connecting directly to our Fabric database. And I'm just going to add some orders. So I'm just going to run a little script to add a few orders. Added looks like 5 or so orders to our orders table in our source database. So we've added those. The Fabric service is monitoring that table. In a few moments here, it will detect that there have been some changes. In fact, we can jump back over and let's save that real quick. We'll jump back over to that monitoring tab that we were on a moment ago. At some point, hopefully you'll see that tick up. The orders table here. As I said, it's not instant, so it's going to take maybe a minute or so. But we should see that order. This is where you get really nervous when you do a live demo. Oh, there we go. So yeah, you can see, and I don't remember what the row counts were, but you see that it's just here within the last moment, a few moments, it's detected some new data. So we jump back over to that report. Again, I don't have to go and refresh a data set or a semantic model in Power BI. You do have to kind of reload the screen. So I think if I go over here and just reload the screen, we should see, there's some October 3rd data. So that's all it took. The data synced out here. It's available immediately. And so if you have Power BI reports that you build on top of that data, kind of that raw data, it's available within, what did that take? Maybe a minute or two. And so your end users that are using it to analyze that data have immediate access to it. And so that's really the, if you think about the way most organizations are doing this today, where you have the nightly ETL process and all the pains of the construction and maintenance of that run on a nightly basis, and somebody has to monitor it, make sure it's working, and then and again, that's usually a fairly expensive process that runs for an hour or two every night. And then if you're using Power BI to do reporting, then you typically have a Power BI semantic model that's built on top of that data from that reporting database, wherever it is that you've landed it. Then you have to schedule a refresh of that, and depending on the size of your data set, that can sometimes be an expensive proposition to have Power BI chug through that data for, in some cases, half an hour or an hour or more to get essentially to get an online version of that data. In that import mode, Power BI will typically bring it out into the service and cache that data set for you, all and make it available in a Power BI report. And again, when you get it into Power BI, the experience is great because it's all been loaded into the Power BI environment. You can filter it and query it, etc. But you get that same experience here, more or less, skipping all those steps, and you get it not on a nightly basis, but you get it almost right away. So that's the vision for what this can be. Now, again, there may be other things you wanted to do with this data to clean it up before you made it available for reporting, and so there may be additional steps involved there. You've got this version of your data out here now in OneLake, so you can do other things with it. You could certainly point Data Factory back to it and transform it maybe into a star schema model. Again, we mentioned like some of the AI capabilities. You can run AI models over the top of the same version of the data without having to ETL it somewhere else or make it available in another data set. Your options are your options are many. You have a lot of choices on what to do with it. So let me jump back into a few more slides. We'll wrap up here in the next 5 or 10 minutes. Then we leave time for some questions. I did in terms of prerequisites here. I skipped over maybe a few quick things. For Azure, for your source database right now, of course, it needs to be in one of these Azure SQL databases. You've got a couple different versions, either a single database or in one of these elastic pools. There are a few kind of boxes you have to check in terms of the size and things like that in order to get a supported version for Azure SQL database that are listed there. There are a few in the Azure in your Fabric tenant, your Power BI tenant, if you want to still think of it that way. There are a few options that need to get turned on. I kind of skipped over those, but those are a few things in your admin portal that one of your Power BI admins will need to make sure are enabled. And you can limit, like most features in Power BI, you can limit who has access to this. So if you've got a fairly wide, Fabric or Power BI deployment, you can sub-select the group of people who have the ability to turn on mirroring, because as I showed you there at one point, you can only mirror these databases once, so you want to be careful maybe who you're letting do this for that reason. But you can obviously lock that down. There are a few other small things in terms of if you've got your SQL database set up, you need to make sure that it's not stuck behind a private network, and you've got to turn on the system assign managed identity so that Power BI can talk to it. The last one is around primary keys. This is one that they technically will tell you that unlike change data capture in SQL Server, it does not require primary keys for these tables to be mirrored over. And while that may be true, and I know they're still working on some of the details of this, I think it's probably best. I tried out a table or two without a primary key, and it synced over, but it has a harder time tracking changes as they come through. So I think your best bet will still be if you have primary keys on all of your tables that you want to have merged. And if not, you're probably going to have to monitor that here closely. And again, I think that's probably still a function of the public preview. I know that's something on the roadmap in terms of being able to do a better job supporting those. But it's just a kind of a little hiccup that I know I ran into when I was setting mine up. We're going to show the three things that get created when you set one of these up right away. These are kind of the out of the box objects that come online as soon as you get that set up. So the mirrored database is where you kind of just check the high level and configure it and monitor the progress. You get the endpoint that you can use with really any SQL related tool, and then you get that default semantic model. We didn't really dig into that in great detail. You do have the ability, of course, to create as many other semantic models on top of this data as you'd like. So if you wanted to customize it, maybe make something a little bit smaller. If you're, for example, mirroring a big ERP system and you want to create a semantic model that's focused on maybe just a small subset of that, you can certainly do that. The default one comes right away or comes automatically. You do have the ability, even within the default semantic model, to control which tables show up in there. And you do have to spend a little bit of time setting up the relationships between those tables, as you typically would in a Power BI semantic model, to make sure that Power BI understands how those tables come together. But those are the three things that you get right away. And as I said, you can do any number of other things with it, like some of the ones we talked about here in terms of your data science, your Power BI, of course, with that direct lake mode that we already showed. I think one of the interesting things that we didn't really talk about here is the ability to create, not only just a single mirror database, but you could mirror multiple databases, of course, and or not even just mirrored. You could have your mirrored database then be able to cross query with other databases that or with other data, I should say, that you may have already out in OneLake, or even shortcuts to other data that comes from other clouds, which is something that you can do in Fabric as well. So you can really see how you can begin to pull these various sets of data together from across the wide expanses of your data estate within your organization, and then use Fabric to kind of be your common or consistent hub for interacting with it. So there's a few questions that come up quite a bit. We talked a little bit about CDC. How is it different? They both use that transaction log. CDC is going to keep track of it internally within that database and expose some store procedures and some data that kind of lives a little below the surface there in SQL Server. OneLake, or I'm sorry, Fabric here just mirrors it directly out to OneLake. Again, there's nothing to turn on in Azure SQL database. There's no to set up CDC or change data capture in SQL Server. There's a handful of little store procedure you have to run to kind of turn it on and configure it. But in this case, Fabric manages all that for you. And as I mentioned, you can't do both at the same time, and you can't mirror it to multiple places at the same time. So it's kind of a one-to-one thing. And then the big one here is cost, what costs associated with it. And this is the good news. So there's no, I should say, zero, zilch, no additional cost. So the base cost here, again, is the Fabric environment itself. So you do need some kind of a Fabric capacity. Those start as low as, for one of those F2, which is the lowest level SKU that you can get into Fabric on, runs about less than $300 a month, I think, on a pay as you go, and you can get it down cheaper than that if you do a reservation. And then you can of course scale that up based on needs. But there's no cost involved with the amount of data that you're pushing out from your source database. If you've got a really chatty source database and you've got hundreds of changes coming every minute, there's no additional cost there. There's no cost even up to these levels here. So I mentioned F2 is the lowest one. So you get, with an F2, you get 2 terabytes of free storage to push your data out into OneLake. And then as you bump up the chain to an F4, you get 4 terabytes and on up it goes. 2 terabytes is a lot, especially for one of those small capacities in Fabric. So there's no, unless you really exceed that, and at which point I think you incur some minor storage cost at the traditional kind of Azure blob storage level. There's no real cost involved in storing the data out there either. So this really is, again, if you have the capacity, the Fabric capacity, there's essentially no extra cost involved with mirroring your database. Now, I guess on the source side, it typically doesn't apply as much to SQL Server, but if you're thinking of like Snowflake, there may be a small cost involved with Snowflake, because Snowflake is going to charge you, to run various queries to push data out of the platform. But and I don't know what to tell you directly in terms of what to expect there, but again, I don't think it's something that you would need to worry about too much on the Azure SQL side. And then roadmap, we kind of already talked about this a little bit, but the big one is that SQL Server on-prem. I know that's certainly the most requested and the one they're hearing the most about. I know they're working on that. I'm sure the challenge there is the connectivity between on-prem and the cloud. If you guys have done some work in SQL Server, there's a tool out there that's called the data gateway that kind of connects your on-prem environment out to Fabric or Power BI. So there's some challenges there. But again, I know they're working on that one. I don't have a firm date to tell you when that's going to happen, but I would expect it, maybe within a year or so, or hopefully less. The one that is they're working on at the moment and should come fairly soon is what they call the Azure SQL Managed Instance. That's similar to a Azure SQL database, but it's a managed instance in SQL, and there may be a path there if you're really interested in getting this going, because I think it's a little easier to move from SQL Server on-prem into an Azure SQL Managed Instance. I think that's a pretty easy lift and shift, if you will. And then if you're able to get the data up there, then I think that would be available. Mirroring will be available for that environment here. I think they're still targeting before the end of the calendar year. And then a few more that I know have at least been mentioned and are at least potentially on the roadmap would be SAP and Oracle down the road. Whether they get there or not, that's probably a little further out. A few other things, just support for additional DDL operations. I didn't have time to show you, but as I mentioned, not only is it smart enough to pick up additional tables as they show up if you turn on that option, but it's also smart enough to pick up changes to the structure of the table. So if you added a column to a table that is already syncing, it will pick that up and sync that over as well. Right now, it's not very intelligent about the way it goes about that. So you need to be a little careful, in fact, because for example, adding a table or changing the DDL structure of a source table will really cause the entire table to be resynced out to the Fabric environment. So if you've got a big table that's got 100 million rows or something, it took you a day or so to sync it over initially, and then you go in and add a column to it. Right now, it's just going to essentially truncate and resync that data. But again, it will pick it up. So I think one of the things they're trying to do is be a little smarter about how it does that in the future. We mentioned some of the restrictions around data types, so they're trying to get better about a few of those, and some of the networking. I think that maybe even relates to the ability to connect to SQL Server on-prem potentially as well. And then the primary keys, I mentioned that one a bit earlier as well in terms of the requirements involved there. So I think that's kind of the big picture here. Again, I just encourage you to kind of think about the way that you manage those ETL processes today within your organization, and what's involved in that, and think about a potential future where you're able to essentially stream those changes out into a reporting environment and have those available for reporting purposes within a minute or two, and what that might mean in terms of possibilities for organization from an analytics standpoint, from a day-to-day reporting standpoint. And I realize right now that the source data types that it can mirror over is somewhat limited, and I don't know how many of you are using Azure SQL database, but my guess is if you are using it, you're probably not using it for some of the what you would call your kind of traditional main reporting source systems. Your ERP platforms and your traditional kind of OLTP databases may not be on that platform yet. So you'll just have to kind of maybe be a little patient with Microsoft as they try to push forward and get some of those other ones we talked about on the roadmap. But if you're interested here, we've got a couple quick offers as we wrap up. If you want to know more, maybe talk in more detail about strategies for your organization, or how we can how you could take advantage of these kind of technologies and tools, we're always willing to come out and do more of an informational session, a more of a deep dive on some of the tech stack that we talked about today, and then maybe have a bit of a whiteboarding session on how that fits into your environment, and what we just call a lunch and learn. It doesn't always have to be over lunch, of course, but we're happy to have those conversations and do that. And then if you're really ready to get started, we offer what we call a Fabric Jumpstart engagement, where we help kind of come out, get the Fabric environment configured, set up. We talk through various governance approaches and how we set up various workspaces, and then of course some of the stuff we talked about today in terms of how data gets into the environment, how we secure that data, et cetera. And so that's another way to kind of work with us and engage on some of this. All right, thanks everyone.